Everyone told her that Cleveland's old steel plant was cursed, that a pregnant woman had no business being there in the dead of winter. But when Grace Carter, homeless, 7 months pregnant, with only her German Shepherd to protect her, used her last $70 to buy a worthless, abandoned storage unit, Ranger began pawing at the back wall. Behind that rotten wood was a hidden compartment, and inside it a letter sealed 30 years ago, and a steel box full of evidence that would expose one of the most powerful men in Ohio. This story isn't just about survival. It's about the day a forgotten dog and a forgotten woman woke up an entire city. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Dense, gray winter pressed down on Cleveland like a heavy, wet wool blanket. Grace Carter, 31, 7 months pregnant, with a belly that curved outward, round and taut, like the last full moon of the year, walked along the frozen sidewalk beside the Cuyahoga River, her breath misting white in the bitter December air. She wore a puffy, second-hand red parka, the kind that was made for ski trips she never had. The coat was missing a button near the chest, so the wind found ways to slip in. She had messy brown hair pulled into a low, loose bun, and a quiet, fragile beauty, white skin with a pale pink tint on the cheeks from the cold. Her long eyelashes fluttered often against the bite of wind, and her eyes, a dark green, almost storm-colored, were haunted, as if she carried too many memories inside for one person, especially one who was carrying a child, too. But she walked with a slow, determined posture, protective hand on her belly, like someone who had learned to survive long before this winter. Right next to her padded Ranger, her German Shepherd, 7 years old, a large, sable-colored dog with thick fur, strong shoulders, and intelligent amber eyes. Ranger was a dog with a soldier's mind, alert, loyal, grounded. His ears constantly rotated and twitched toward every sound: cars passing, ice, cracking wings of gulls beating overhead. Ranger was lean, tall, and his gait was smooth, almost regal, but his face held the softness of a dog that knew exactly who his human was, and that his job every hour of every day was to guard her. People who saw them on the street sometimes muttered that the dog looked better fed than the woman. It was true. Grace always split her food 30-70. Ranger got the 70. She figured the baby and the dog deserved the calories more than she did. Under the Detroit Superior Bridge, a city sanitation truck had stopped. A man in reflective orange and navy municipal jacket was waving a clipboard, yelling at two other workers moving orange cones. His name tag said P. Donahue. Patrick Donahue was around 50, thick, body-shaved head, salt and pepper stubble. He had the calm, tired eyes of someone who had worked too many city winters. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't warm. He was the kind of man who had spent 20 years taking orders and delivering bad news because the system said so. He pointed toward Grace and spoke with apology in his voice, but authority in his posture. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. We got a directive. You can't sleep under here anymore. City's clearing all bridge camps. Liability issue." His tone was weary. He wasn't threatening her. It was more like he was telling her it was time to leave an old life behind. Grace nodded, swallowing a lump in her throat. "I understand." Patrick hesitated, hands in pockets. "There's a shelter on West 25th. Grace didn't say what she already knew. Shelters didn't take big dogs, especially German shepherds. Ranger sat when she stopped. Ears forward, chest puffed. Patrick saw the dog and simply nodded once, respectful. "Be safe," he said. He meant it. Then he turned and shouted orders to the other guys, and the municipal truck rumbled off. Grace stood a moment longer beneath the cold stone of the bridge. She thought very quietly inside her own skull about how everything in her life felt like that moment she was never thrown out violently, but the world always nudged her just a bit farther away from safety, a bit farther away from belonging, until there was no place left that wanted her at all. She looked down at Ranger. "Well, boy," she whispered, rubbing his ear. "We've been kicked out of nicer places." Ranger nuzzled her hand, pushing his cold nose against her palm, and she felt a sudden sting in her eyes. Tears tried to come, but she blinked them back. Pregnant women cry easily. Sure, but Grace had trained herself not to give the world the satisfaction of watching her break, especially not in the middle of the street. She lifted her chin. "Let's go." She pushed her rusted shopping cart forward, the cart that contained her entire life in 3 trash bags and 1 dented pot, and walked toward the bus stop. She counted the money in her pocket when she sat down a crumpled 50, a 10, and 2 5s. $70. Everything she had left. $70 for a woman and a dog and a baby not yet born. She had to use it wisely. She had read something 3 days ago on a damp flyer blowing against a dumpster near the loading docks storage locker auction. The kind where delinquent storage units get sold off to the highest bidder. Sometimes people found furniture, tools, a guitar, sometimes even a box of collectibles. It was almost always trash, but once in a while, there was something someone forgot about something that could be sold. Grace had never gambled on luck in her life. She had gambled on her own ability to fight through pain. She knew certainty. If she walked an extra 20 blocks, she would find an alley to sleep in. If she skipped eating today, she would feel hunger tomorrow. But gambling on chance, that was foolish. But pregnancy changes gamble into instinct. When you are carrying a life inside you, begin thinking like a predator cornered in a cave. Every wrong move is death, and every strange, risky turn could be a hidden exit. So she decided she would bet the last of her money on the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was something inside one of those storage units that could buy her even 1 week more of survival. Even 1 week was enough. 1 week more meant 1 week closer to the due date. 1 week more meant one more chance to work out the impossible question of how to bring a child into a world that had no space for her. The bus was late. Cleveland buses in December always run late. She rubbed her belly, slowly feeling the baby shift under her palm. Inside her, there was a kick, gentle but firm. She smiled weakly. Hey, you're still here. You still believe. The bus came finally, a diesel beast groaning through frost. The driver, an elderly black man in a thick knitted beanie, narrowed his eyes when she stepped up with the cart and the dog. His name tag read H. Collins. He was maybe 60, skin dark and smooth with deep smile lines and a calm, patient expression that hinted at a lifetime of late shifts, lost passengers, and bad weather. Dog's gotta stay by your side, he said firmly, but not unkindly. I'm not throwing a pregnant lady out in this weather. His voice sounded like someone who had raised daughters. Grace gave a small, grateful smile. Thank you, she whispered. The bus heater rattled weak, warm air. Ranger lay between her feet, head up, watchful. Grace stared out the window as the industrial warehouses slid by in gray-white blur. Her whole world had collapsed into one simple math problem. $70 must become more than $70, or everything ends. She pressed her hand to her stomach again. She imagined her baby. A little girl, maybe. Small hands, soft skin, clean crib. A room with warm sunlight, not fluorescent shelter light. A life where she would never have to worry about being thrown out from under a bridge. I will not let you be born into this. Grace swore silently to her child. I will take one insane chance today, even if it's stupid, because I owe you at least one small miracle. The bus pulled into the industrial storage district. Grace stood up slowly. Ranger stood with her, and they stepped off the bus into the icy wind. Ahead, bright blue roll-up doors stretched like a wall of forgotten secrets. Lakeview Storage Auction. Today. Grace took a deep breath. Ranger exhaled a cloud of warm breath beside her. And with only $70 left in this wide, cold world, she decided to take her shot. Lakeview. Storage looked less like a place ordinary people came to, and more like a battlefield for a quiet subculture of men who treated forgotten belongings like stock trades. Grace Carter pushed forward her rusted cart Ranger at her heel as she entered the main lot. Dozens of people stood gathered near the row of blue roll-up doors, their breath outlined like steam in the frozen air. Most of them were men mid-aged, with hardened eyes and expensive flashlights auction regulars. The kind of men who had made a sport out of looking at other people's abandoned lives, then flipping it for profit. They smelled like truck grease tobacco and tax write-offs. One man near the front wore a dark red flannel jacket under a thick leather vest, tall, bulky shoulders, and a handlebar mustache so black it looked drawn with ink. His name tag read Eddie. Eddie Tyson was known among local storage auction circles. Everyone in line glanced at him, as if silently acknowledging he was already the favorite. Eddie was a former mechanic, mid-40s, tan skin, from years under the sun, hands large like thick tools, knuckles scraped. He had the look of a man who once smashed an engine block with a hammer and laughed. Rumor said he had been divorced twice. Some said his temper had contributed. Some said his stubborn pride had ruined everything. Eddie eyed Grace briefly and immediately dismissed her. She was nobody in this arena. She was a pregnant woman with a sad cart and cheap shoes. She had no flashlight in hand, no experienced stance. She was prey in a market of wolves. Grace felt her stomach tighten, not from the baby kicking, but from the pressure of humiliation that always came when she entered spaces where she didn't seem to belong. She swallowed, trying to appear invisible. Ranger sat beside her, posture firm, ear twitching toward every voice. The auctioneer walked out of the office. He was a thin, white man in his late 30s, with a wiry body and narrow face, wearing an orange safety vest over a camo hoodie. His name was called out by one of the bidders. "Hey, Mason." So his name was Mason Lee. Mason had the posture and tone of a man who organized chaos for a living. Rapid, cold, efficient. His cheekbones were sharp, like someone who never quite ate enough, but burned 1,000 calories a day through tension. Mason clapped his hands loudly. All right, folks, we got 9 units today, cash only. You look, you don't step inside. You touch nothing. Bids start when I say they start. Let's get to it. Grace felt her hand instinctively rest on her belly again. She whispered to herself, "Don't panic, don't panic, don't panic." Ranger's warm body pressed slightly into her leg, his version of grounding her, a silent, "I'm still here." The group moved to the first unit. When Mason pulled the metal door open, a blast of dusty, cold air escaped. Inside were power tools, fishing gear, and what looked like a chainsaw. Eddie's posture changed. He could smell money. The bidding exploded. 100, 200, 350. Grace didn't even speak. She had 70. She watched. Unit after unit, old appliances, boxed electronics, old furniture that looked expensive. The men moved like vultures, circling meat. Grace stood still, shrinking deeper inside herself. She had known coming here was a gamble, but she didn't expect the humiliation to feel this sharp. They reached the last row. Mason looked almost annoyed, voice starting to flatten from fatigue and cold. "All right, final one for the day." He cut the lock. The metal snapped loudly. The door rattled up. Grace leaned slightly, trying to see. This unit looked like the saddest place on earth. Sagging cardboard boxes, their sides wet and black. A broken lamp. Plastic bags that looked like they had been dragged out of garbage bins. The smell that came out was mold and old wet carpet. One of the bidders laughed. Who the hell stored this? Another groaned. Eddie didn't even shine his flashlight. Trash. He turned away. The whole group started walking back. Mason tried to keep some energy alive. Starting at 50, anyone. Silence. Mason sighed. 20. Nothing. His eyes landed on Grace because she was literally the only one still standing and looking at the unit. Ranger stood beside her, alert, curious. Mason pointed. You want it. 20. Grace's heart thudded violently. She knew she had to choose now. 20 would leave her 50. 50 could mean food. It could mean a motel for one night if she lied about the dog. But if she spent 70, she'd have nothing. But she thought of the baby. She thought of one miracle. Her lips parted. 50. The air shifted. A man who had been leaving turned back to smirk. 60. he said passive-aggressively. Grace felt a spike of fear. That 60 was just to humiliate her. She swallowed. 70, she said. Her whole body trembled. It was everything. Mason slammed his clipboard. Sold for $70. He took her crumpled bills. She felt like she had just ripped skin off her own bones. Ranger nudged her hand, sensing the fear that was suddenly radiating through her veins, like smoke. Mason gave her the carbon slip. 48 hours to clear it. Then he walked off. The men dispersed like wolves, leaving a corpse behind. Grace stood before the darkness of the unit. Ranger sniffed. Grace grabbed a broken piece of wood to act like a lever. She stepped inside. The air was disgusting. She coughed. She started poking at boxes. Nothing but mold. Wet magazines stuck together like tar. Her stomach twisted. She had used everything she had for this. Rage, shame, panic, like a cocktail, rose all at once. She pressed her forehead into her sleeve, hiding her face. The baby kicked. She froze, eyes wide. "I'm sorry," she whispered internally. "I'm sorry I gambled your life like this." A whining sound interrupted her. Ranger was at the back wall, standing on his hind legs, sniffing intensely. His claws scratching, not like playful digging, but like tracking something real. "Ranger." "Stop," Grace said weakly. Ranger ignored. He scratched again. Grace walked over. The wall was a large sheet of cheap plywood. But as Grace lifted her small phone light, she saw something she had not noticed before. The stains weren't random. They ran in 2 perfect straight lines, vertical. She slid her fingers along them. Those were seams. Her heart began pounding differently. Not fear this time. Something like adrenaline. Something like hope. She found a rusted tire iron buried under trash. She wedged it into the seam. The wood creaked. Ranger backed up, ears sharp. Grace pushed with all the strength a small, pregnant woman could have left. Crack! The plywood tore. It swung out dust, exploding into the air. Behind it was not a wall. It was a narrow, hidden void. Inside that void, sitting neatly on the concrete floor, were 3 objects. A small, polished, dark wooden box. A sealed, thick envelope with red wax stamped in a ring. And a heavy steel case, matte black, secured with 3 combination locks. Grace stared. Her mind went blank. Ranger whined softly, pressing his head against her hip. Grace whispered, barely breathing, What is this? And for the first time in a very long time, she felt something ignite inside her chest that she thought was extinct. Belief. Grace knelt inside the dim storage unit, her knees cracking on the cold concrete as her breath came out in slow, visible streams. Ranger sat beside her, body alert, tail stiff ears, perfectly erect, like a carved statue of a sentinel wolf. The discovered items sat between them like small planets of danger. The dark wooden box, the heavy steel case, and the sealed envelope marked with a thick red wax seal. The seal had a symbol. Grace could not identify it at first glance. It looked like a ring around a stylized L. Her pulse hammered in her neck. She felt the baby move again. This time, not a soft nudging kick, but a slow roll beneath her ribs, almost like her unborn child sensed the rising electricity of fear. Something in Grace told her that if she opened the envelope, her entire life would split into two, before and after. There was no halfway. She wiped her fingers on her jeans, then gently broke the wax seal. Inside was a thick, folded letter on paper that had clearly aged. Not yellow, like brittle antique paper. This paper had been sealed, hidden from light. But the edges had softened, curled slightly, and the ink, blue ink, had that faded, water-stained look that came from sweat and time. She unfolded the letter. The handwriting was shaky, unsteady, but elegant. Someone educated, someone who once cared how his pen strokes looked. The letter began. My name is Theodore Lane. If you are reading this, I am dead. Grace blinked. She reread the line, slowly. The dying confession tone of the scripted sentence reached straight into her bloodstream. Theodore Lane. The surname rang faintly familiar, not from life, but from local news. Maybe Cleveland history, maybe activism. She kept reading. In the letter, Theodore wrote about his brother, Jonathan Lane. Jonathan was a local environmental activist in the mid-90s, a man who believed Cleveland's toxic industrial sites could be reclaimed into clean community spaces. He was described as tall with copper hair, always tousled, a lean body, laugh lines carved at the corners of his bright eyes, someone who spoke with fire, but smiled with softness, a person who people trusted instinctively. Jonathan Lane had apparently been a beacon to many, especially in the environmental community. Theodore described Jonathan as the kind of man who would help strangers move couches for free, who would buy pizza for the whole room after a meeting, and who refused corporate money even when his organization desperately needed funds. Ranger leaned down and sniffed the pages as Grace turned them. The baby kicked again. The letter detailed how in 1996, Jonathan Lane found evidence of a massive cover-up involving a real estate project planned by a rising Cleveland development magnate named Richard Palmer. Palmer was now a huge name in the city. Grace actually recognized his name immediately. Palmer's buildings were on billboards, gala events, and every time local news did growth and innovation segments, his name appeared. Richard Palmer was in his late 60s, now silver-haired, broad-shouldered, in expensive suits, always with that politician-perfect smile in photographs, teeth aligned like ceramic tiles. Grace remembered seeing his face on a brochure outside a bank last month. He had a paternal aura, someone who looked like a grandfather, who gave expensive gifts and gentle advice. But Theodore's letter said he was a monster. Theodore spilled everything Jonathan had proof that Palmer bribed multiple city inspectors to hide toxic soil levels at an old steelworks site along the Cuyahoga River, Cuyahoga Steelworks. The documents proved Palmer planned to build commercial hubs without cleaning the poison. Jonathan had planned to go public, but 3 days before he could, he died. His office accidentally exploded from a reported gas leak. Except Theodore testified in this letter, he knew it was not an accident. The gas line had been tampered. Theodore had lived 29 years in fear since. He hid the evidence inside a storage unit, registered under a fake name, paying monthly more than he could afford. Theodore used the rest of the letter to confess how he became a coward. He described himself short, skinny, pale, with thinning, sandy hair, and glasses that always slid down his nose. He had a soft, quivering voice. He was someone who never wanted confrontation. He wrote how even as a child he hated loud voices, hated fights, hated being looked at directly. And after Jonathan died, men came to see him. Theodore never named them. He described them vaguely large shoulders, manicured hands, voices like velvet knives. They told him they knew he had some of Jonathan's files. They told him he should care about his own survival. Theodore wrote that fear changed him. He ran, sold his brother's legacy, his land, even his own sense of dignity. He sealed the documents inside this hidden compartment in the storage unit, praying for a stranger in some far future to find them someone brave, someone unafraid. Grace lifted her eyes from the letter. She stared at the steel case. The hilt of anxiety coiled in her belly. That steel case suddenly felt heavier than the universe. Inside, if Theodore was telling truth, were the original ledgers of bribes, the original falsified permits, and the original deed for the entire Cuyahoga Steelworks site. That deed, if legitimate, meant the land was legally never fully transferred. It meant there was a legal crack that could bury Richard Palmer's empire if sunlight hit it. Grace's mind trembled. She thought, I am nobody. She thought I am just a pregnant woman with a cart and a dog. She thought, why me? Ranger nudged her again this time, pushing his muzzle under her hand. She thought, maybe because no one else would pay attention. She turned the steel case over slightly. It was very heavy. Cool, matte, black, no labels. 3 combination locks. She recognized the type military grade. She had seen something like this years ago in a picture. Once, she had dated a man in his 20s named Eric Krawitz, skinny, pale ginger, freckles, a man who was obsessed with military gear. Eric had worked at an army surplus warehouse before he left her suddenly. He loved locked tactical cases and always bragged about how some old tactical boxes were triple locked to protect classified material. He once told her that certain military cases would outlive the people who stored them. The memory of Eric passed through her mind unexpectedly, an old bruise. She pushed it away. Ranger pressed closer to her thigh. Grace took a breath. She felt a pulsing fear. She felt the sharpness of responsibility. She whispered, this could destroy a man who built an empire. She whispered again, this could destroy me too. She looked at her belly. I cannot let her come into a world where people like that win. She reached inside the storage unit. Again, grabbed the wooden box. It clicked open easily. Inside were small personal items, old photographs of Jonathan smiling with his daughter. Even without a name, Grace could tell it was his daughter. The same bright eyes, same stubborn chin, small drawings, a silver locket. These were not evidence, they were memories. She placed them carefully into her backpack. She wrapped the sealed letter in a clean folder she stole from her cart's junk pile. She then tried lifting the steel case. It took everything in her arms. Ranger immediately shifted stance, protective. She realized she could not carry all 3 items out in plain sight. But she could not leave them here unsecured. Her heart raced again. The baby moved again, harda sudden. Grace whispered, hold on. I'm fighting for you now. She dragged with slow force the steel case toward the back of the unit again, then dragged nearby boxes and collapsed cardboard over it to camouflage. She would return later with a plan, because right now she needed to breathe and think. She pocketed the letter. She tightened her gloves. She looked at Ranger. "We are in deep now, boy." Ranger's amber eyes were steady, unafraid. Grace closed the unit door, locked it. She looked back at the blue metal door, and she knew her life had just divided in two. The world where she was just a homeless, pregnant woman was gone. The world where she now carried a lethal truth and a target had begun. Grace didn't go straight to the abandoned steelworks first. She sat on the curb outside Lakeview, storage ranger, leaning against her leg like a furnace made of muscle and fur, and she stared at the street for 2 minutes that felt like 40. She needed to decide how to move without losing everything. A man pushing a food cart passed by slowly. He was short, Latino, probably late 60s, with a white mustache so full it looked like a little snowy broom over his lips, wrinkled cheeks, eyes tired, but sweet. His name tag on the cart said Jesus, but pronounced like Jesus, so he must have been Mexican-American. He glanced politely at Grace. He didn't stare at her belly or her poverty. He simply nodded, once human to human, as if he understood what no one else did. "Cold morning," he said, voice gentle, like someone who had seen a lot of struggling souls and had learned not to intrude on their pride. Grace nodded. Yeah, she didn't buy anything. She had no money left, but she remembered his face, because he looked like the sort of person who had lived a hard life and came out soft, not cruel. That mattered. It reminded her she did not want to become cruel either. She stood up. Ranger rose with her. She grabbed the steel case, groaned under its weight, and moved. Cuyahoga Steel Works had been abandoned for 20 years. The front gates had rusted into jagged brown teeth. The wind off the river carved through the broken windows like knives. Grace slipped inside through a side door that had been forced open long ago. Inside it looked like a whale carcass of Ohio's industrial past, hollow, giant ribs of steel beams, floors, flooded walls of cracked tile. She found a forgotten tool room with a metal cabinet. She shoved aside old wrenches and ancient oily rag bunks and pushed the steel case behind a pile of rusted metal containers. Ranger whined because he sensed fear, but not danger, fear from Grace, not from predators outside. Grace crouched low and whispered, "I'll come back. This is the only place no one looks anymore." Her voice trembled slightly. Ranger licked the back of her hand. Step 1 was done. The bomb was hidden. Step 2, she needed proof this was real. She needed to confirm names, find the living piece in this story, the daughter. If she found the daughter, she would know this wasn't just a paranoid letter written by a dying man. She left the steelworks and headed toward a bus stop. She had $0 left. She approached the bus anyway and put her hand on her belly before the driver even spoke. Sometimes being a pregnant woman felt like a curse. But sometimes the world allowed pity. The driver, this time, was a black woman, maybe in her early 50s, with tight curls, dyed burgundy, and a heavy eyeliner wing. Her name tag said Daria. Daria looked like the kind of auntie who would curse someone out in a grocery store line if they cut an old lady tough but righteous. She looked Grace up and down, then looked at the dog. "I shouldn't let that dog in," she said, voice low. Grace whispered, "Please, I just need to get to the downtown library." Daria stared into Grace's eyes for a moment, saw something raw there, and then opened the door wider. "Sit near the back. Keep your dog close." She didn't ask for fare. Grace whispered, "Thank you." Daria waved it away. She was one of those women who didn't need thanks. She needed to feel that she did the right thing. The Cleveland Public Library main branch was a massive marble cathedral, to knowledge warm and bright against the gray outside. Grace walked in anxiety, squeezing tight in her throat. She had not been inside a library for 6 years. The last time, she had been running from something else, too. The front librarian, white mid-30s, square glasses, brown ponytail, skin pale from too much indoor time, looked up. Her name tag read Sarah Kelly. Sarah had a familiar face, soft, narrow shoulders, neat cardigan, pastel blouse, someone who lived in quiet routines. She looked like a person who ate the same lunch every day and organized her pens by color. She had librarian energy, calm but structured. She saw Ranger and stiffened. Animals aren't permitted normally. Grace lowered her voice. Emotional support. "I'm pregnant. I just need some public computer time." Sarah hesitated, but then nodded, likely calculating that a pregnant woman with a German shepherd wasn't a threat, just someone in trouble. 20 minutes per computer session, she said. "If you need longer, ask me." Grace sat down at a terminal. Her fingers shook as she typed Jonathan Lane, Cleveland, 1996. Hundreds of old news articles, local op-eds, photos. Then she typed Jonathan Lane, daughter Cleveland. A name surfaced. Audrey Lane. There were articles from 3 months ago where Audrey was quoted as leader of a grassroots organization against new riverfront development plans by Palmer Development Group. Audrey was in her early 30s now, according to the article. A photo in a news interview showed her tall, slender build, light brown skin, curly dark hair, cut in a short bob, sharp dark brows, expression intense. She had her father's eyes. She was beautiful in a way that wasn't glamour. It was conviction. The article described her voice in council meetings as steady, fierce, polished. She was the kind of person who read every legal line. She was the kind of person who could rip a billionaire's proposal apart using only city codes and environmental impact studies. Grace clicked deeper. Audrey had been speaking publicly at rallies at a place called Wade Oval, an open lawn in University Circle, bordered by museums and cultural institutions. There were pictures of her speaking into a megaphone. Behind her, posters read, "Not another poisoned riverfront." Grace printed the photo of Audrey and a photo Grace had taken of Jonathan's picture found in the wooden box. She wrote a note, not handwriting anyone could identify. She wrote only this: "I know what happened to your father. The truth still exists. If you want to see it, meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. at Wade Oval by the museum steps. I will bring proof. Please come alone." She folded the note and attached both photographs. She addressed it only to Audrey Lane. She needed an envelope. She approached Sarah quietly. "Do you have a blank envelope?" "I could have." Sarah blinked slightly, thrown by that request, but nodded. She handed her one from a drawer. Ranger sat perfectly still at Grace's side, like he was part of library security. Grace slid the note inside, sealed it. She looked at her belly. The baby moved faintly, maybe calm now, maybe resting. She whispered under her breath, "Tomorrow, everything changes again." Outside the library, she found a blue USPS drop box and slid the envelope in. She whispered a prayer, not to God, but to randomness, to fate, to the small percentage chances that have shaped her whole life. Then she and Ranger returned to the steelworks. In the cold, dark room, Grace pressed her palm against the steel case she had hidden earlier. She whispered, "Stay alive until tomorrow." She curled up in the corner to sleep. Ranger, lying with his spine against her stomach, to warm her and the child. Night fell around that abandoned place, but inside, Grace, something like purpose began to glow. Wade Oval that morning was so white it felt like somewhere the world had been erased and not yet rewritten. Snow was falling, but not in graceful flurries. These flakes were thick, heavy, wet, the kind that slapped skin like tiny icy hands. The lagoon in the center of the oval was entirely frozen over a pale sheet of glass that had swallowed autumn whole, and the wind whipped across that surface like a blade. Grace Carter arrived early. Ranger walked slightly in front of her tail, up his paws, making neat, compact prints through the snow. Every step Grace took was slow. Part of that was pregnancy weight. Her body had shifted center months ago, but some of it was fear. Because this was the moment where she was choosing to bring another human into this secret. Grace wore the red second-hand parka zipped to the neck, her cheeks pale and red and raw from windburn, her brown hair tucked under a knit cap that had lost elasticity years ago. She paced near the art museum steps. She couldn't sit. If she sat, she might lose nerve. She had the photo of Jonathan Lane and the copy of the letter. 10 minutes later, a woman emerged from the direction of the botanical garden walkway. Even before Grace saw her face, she knew it was Audrey. She recognized the posture. Audrey. Lane was tall, maybe 5'10", slender, with an angular frame and long limbs like someone who used to run track in high school. She had light brown skin with a golden undertone, and her dark curly hair was tied in a tight braided tuck at the back. She wore a navy wool coat, tailored perfectly charcoal scarf tucked inside gloves, black leather. She looked like a woman who had learned to armor her body elegantly. Audrey approached slowly, chin slightly, lifted shoulders, pulled back, exuding that specific kind of wary poise that activists carried, poise that was half dignity, half survival, instinct. When she stopped 3 feet away, her eyes flicked to Ranger. Grace saw her assess him, instantly size breed posture. But Ranger was sitting, not tense, not aggressive, just watching. Audrey spoke first. Her voice was cool, low, steady. "You sent the letter." It wasn't a question. Grace nodded. "I did." Audrey's eyes narrowed. Grace had never been confronted by someone who could parse truth like that through a single stare. Audrey had eyes like judges. Audrey spoke again, sharper. "Why should I even talk to you? I get crazy anonymous letters all the time." Grace swallowed and slowly held out the old printed photo she found in the wooden box, the photo of Jonathan Lane holding a small toddler with the same eyes Audrey had now. Audrey froze. For 1 second, just one, her mask cracked. The muscles around her eyes softened. Her breath hitched, and she looked not like an activist, not like a grown woman. She looked like a daughter. She reached out slowly and took the photo, her gloved fingers trembling. "Where did you get this?" Grace's breath came faster. "I found evidence. The real evidence. I think your father was killed for exposing Palmer." Audrey breathed out a shaky laugh. No humor, just shock. People have claimed that for years. Every conspiracy crank in Ohio thinks they're Woodward and Bernstein when it comes to Palmer. Grace shook her head. "This isn't rumors. I have a letter. His brother wrote it. Theodore Lane." Audrey's eyes widened in recognition. Uncle Theo. Grace nodded. Audrey looked like the wind had knocked the air from her ribs. He disappeared. He just left town one day. No forwarding address. My mother never heard from him again. Grace pulled out the sealed letter in plastic. "This is his confession." Audrey stared at the packet like it was radioactive. Ranger suddenly growled low ears, pointed north like radar. Not loud, but direct. Audrey flinched. Grace turned slightly, eyes scanning the snow-white expanse. A black SUV was parked across the oval engine, running tinted windows. Two men stood near a sculpture piece, both wearing long overcoats. One man, tall, square-jaw hair shaved close to head. The other, shorter, thicker, neck hands in pockets. They were pretending to admire the statue, but their shoulders were angled at Grace and Audrey. Grace felt ice crawl up her spine. Palmer Audrey's voice was nearly a whisper. "He has watchers everywhere." Audrey's voice changed in that second, from wary to terrified. "We need to leave. Now." They started walking. Ranger stayed on Grace's right side, forming a moving shield. Audrey's heels stabbed through snow like weapons. "We can't go to the police," Audrey said breathlessly. "Half the city council gets campaign money from Palmer. Even if we got someone honest, the chain of custody would get corrupted." Grace nodded. "We need someone outside the system." Audrey looked at her sharply. "Exactly." Grace hesitated, then asked, "Do you know anyone like that?" Audrey clenched her jaw. "Maybe. My father once told me when I was 13 that if anything ever happened to him, there was one person he trusted to tell the truth." Grace looked at her eyes, wide. Audrey's voice lowered Jack Harris. Grace didn't know the name. Audrey explained rapidly while they kept walking. "He used to be FBI white man, late 50s. Now, tall, thin, bald top with salt and pepper, sides, goatee trimmed, neat. He left the bureau after exposing corruption in his field office. He never got credit. They forced him into early retirement. Now he works as a private investigator. paranoid, brilliant, incorruptible. Audrey exhaled. If someone can verify the evidence, it's him. The two men across the oval started walking toward them. Not fast, not loud, but purposeful. Grace grabbed Audrey's sleeve. Don't look back, but two men are closing. Audrey did not turn. She whispered, "Ranger, go wider." Grace clicked her tongue twice. Ranger peeled out in a slow curve flanking one side. One of the men paused, startled by the dog's intelligence. That hesitation gave Grace and Audrey the last 5 seconds they needed to reach the stone steps of the museum, which had 2 security guards near the front doors. The guards were unarmed, but present. That was enough. The men backed off, fading back toward the SUV. The SUV turned tires, crunching over ice, and drove off. Grace's heart pounded like she had sprinted a mile. Audrey whispered, voice cracking for the first time. They must have been tailing me since the council meeting yesterday. Grace steadied her breathing. We need a safer meeting point. Audrey nodded. Come to Cedar Village. Apartments at sunset. She then hesitated, fear flickering, but no too obvious, too traceable. She shook her head. There's a coffee shop on Euclid called Harbor and Grain. Near Case Western Campus, the owner is a refugee couple. That place is too politically messy for Palmer's men to openly tail inside. Grace nodded slowly. Audrey reached into her coat, handed Grace a small notepad paper. Address scribbled. Audrey looked Grace dead in the eyes. If you're lying to me, if any of this is fake, I'll expose you publicly, and I won't blink. Grace answered with equal steel. If I was lying, do you think I'd bring a dog to a meet? Audrey blinked once, surprised by the logic. Grace took one last breath. I have something that will destroy Richard Palmer. If we move smart, we can bring him down. Audrey swallowed hard. Then tomorrow, we go to Jack Harris. Together. She turned and walked away, her figure cutting across the white field like a thin, dark exclamation mark against winter. Grace and Ranger walked back toward the steelworks, snow falling harder, now sealing all their footprints behind them, like the world trying to erase evidence. Jack Harris's office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building that had once been a printing press. High windows, a radiator that clanked like an old man clearing his throat, and stacks of manila folders that made alleys between desks. Jack himself was the kind of man whose face announced a life of professional friction. Tall and wire-thin shoulders that had learned to carry weight without showing it, head largely bald on top, with silvering hair at the temples, and a close-cropped goatee that made his mouth look practiced in lines. His skin was wind-weathered, as if the FBI had left a map of cold offices and wiretaps etched into it. There was an intensity to him that wasn't the quick kind. It was slow, deliberate, as if every motion had been checked against a ledger of consequences. People who knew him said Jack had been swallowed by one case too many. Exposed corruption in his own field office, watched his colleagues get promoted while evidence was buried, and then left with a boiled-away faith in institutions. That history had made him quiet, meticulous, and very dangerous in the realm of procedure. He kept a small workshop in one corner of the office, a wooden tray with picks in foam, a tension wrench, a roll of electrical tape, an old stethoscope, and a battered torque screwdriver. He also kept an army surplus canvas rucksack that smelled faintly of oil and black coffee. When Grace and Audrey arrived with Ranger, Jack was already waiting. Sleeves rolled, eyes rimmed with fatigue but focused. He greeted them with a nod, not a smile. "You did the right thing, getting me this far," he said. His voice was low and rasped the product of too many late nights and cigarettes once promised to be given up. Jack set the steel case on his battered workbench and ran a gloved hand over the matte surface. 3 combination locks, he said, half to himself, half to them. Not trivial. Old-school military stuff, but not impossible. He took his stethoscope and laid the chest piece on the first lock, then placed the earpieces into his ears. He turned the dial slowly, listening for the infinitesimal clicks of pins dropping the tiny micro-movements that a practiced ear could translate into numbers. He worked with the grim patience of a surgeon. Tap, listen, pause, turn, until a soft click announced the first lock yielding. Audrey watched every motion as if she were watching a ritual, because in a way they were resurrecting truth from its tomb. The second lock required a different approach. Jack used a pick to feel for tiny disruptions in the tumblers, his thumb-steady jaw clenched. He hummed under his breath, a metronome, to keep his hands calm. When the second gave way, a small exhale escaped his lips, almost a smile. The third lock fought back the longest, as if the case itself did not want to be opened. Jack cursed softly and swapped to a narrower pick, fingers nimble despite his age. Finally, with 3 soft, mechanical sighs, the latches released. He lifted the lid. Inside a leather-bound journal with meticulous, spidery handwriting. A stack of manila folders stamped with municipal seals, but obviously altered. 2 thick accounting ledgers, edges stained with time and coffee. And at the very bottom, a small black microcassette recorder its tape still coiled inside. "This is it," Audrey whispered, leaning forward as if proximity could better hold the truth. Jack's face did not slacken into triumph. Instead, he turned practical. "We don't parade this around," he said. "We document, we duplicate, and we control chain of custody. People who move fast get tripped up. People who move slow survive." He retrieved a set of digital imaging tools, an old flatbed scanner, a digital voice recorder, and a cheap laptop with encrypted drives. He worked methodically, scanning ledger pages, photographing seals, and handing Audrey a gloved copy of a page with ledger entries. As he worked, the room felt safe, a small island of procedure and rigor. That changed abruptly. The street outside his brick building had been quiet all day. Now boots crunched on the grit, too many and too purposeful. Jack's face went still. "They found our scent," he said, no need for flourish. He moved like a man who had rehearsed retreat and diversion a dozen times. He grabbed the heavy steel case, slung it into the trunk of his old pickup, a Ford that had the honest dents of a man who refused new things, and started the engine. "I'll take it out," he told them. "Make noise. Here, draw them." Audrey's hand closed on the folder. Grace's pulse thudded irregular. "No," Audrey said, then corrected herself with the steadiness she'd developed confronting men in council meetings. "We go with you. We don't split. They'll follow whoever moves." Jack looked at Ranger, whose amber eyes met his like two beacons connecting. "Better you don't," Jack said. "Dogs complicate things." For a heartbeat, the room felt like a wire stretched too tight. Jack's plan would require deception and speed. He took only the steel case and a folder, then locked the office door behind him. He drove out with headlights off, leaving the three of them in the office, where the faint hum of the scanner filled the silence. Within minutes, loud boots hit the stairwell. Outside, two men burst in coats, heavy their faces hard. They were Palmer's kind, well-dressed men who did not look as if they had ever had hands blistered by honest labor. The taller of the two had a scar that ran like a riverbed from his cheek to his jaw, and eyes that never quite smiled. He barked. "Where did he go? Where's Harris?" The shorter man was thick-necked and had a way of breathing that suggested violence practiced for its efficiency. They ransacked the office with professional speed, overturning a bookshelf, riffling papers, with a contempt for anything that might slow them. Grace felt freeze-clamped to the floor. At first, then adrenaline snapped her to attention. She pulled Audrey and Ranger into a small stairwell and started down Ranger, pressing close, breathing warm and steady in her ear. Suddenly, Jack's truck thundered in the alley. Moments later, engine revving like a baited animal. The men ran outside. Grace and Audrey sprinted out a service door and circled the block, hugging shadows. Ranger's body felt electric beside Grace. They could hear the men curse at a truck that had taken an unexpected left, swearing at a decoy that had taken the bait. Jack's voice came at them over a burner phone. Go to the Meridian lot. Head for the security office. Don't stop. He had plotted a loop meant to make the tail think the box was in motion on a highway route. He knew the men would commit to a chase. His life as an ex-agent had taught him this: people who believe power can buy them speed will overreach. The alley route was slick. Audrey's gloved hands burned with cold as she hauled them faster than she thought possible. Ranger, sensing the circle tightening, ran a little ahead, and then veered, barking, bounding down an adjacent lane as if to intercept. One of the pursuers lunged toward the dog, and for a frantic moment, the world narrowed to the flash of teeth and the crash of bodies. Ranger barked ferociously, teeth bared, but never bit. Instead, his sudden, loud presence broke the hunter's rhythm and bought Grace and Audrey crucial seconds. They slipped through the rusted fence into the cavernous reverberation of the Meridian steelworks. Inside, the factory swallowed their panting breaths. Metal skeletons towered like a ruined city. They ran to the small brick security office Grace had found earlier and barricaded the door with a broken chair and a metal shelf. They shoved the remaining cardboard over the hiding place and then collapsed their lungs, burning hearts, hammering a tribal rhythm. Outside, distant vehicles and raised voices faded like waves. Inside the tiny office, lit only by the weak glow of Jack's emergency lantern, left in a corner, Audrey pressed a hand to her chest and let out one long, unsteady breath. Grace reached for Ranger and buried her face in his warm fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of him like an anchor. "We're not safe," Audrey said finally, voice rough. "But we have proof." Grace folded her hands over her stomach and let a strange, brittle kind of relief wash through her fear, braided tightly with purpose. The night was a trap, but they had survived it. They had the ledgers, the tape, the journal. For the first time since she had used those $70, Grace allowed herself to imagine not just surviving another day, but making the day come. The night inside the old mill was a kind of darkness that didn't sit above the ground, but lived inside the walls. It felt like the silence had texture like old iron, could hold ghosts the way a sponge holds water. Grace gathered pallet wood, broken slats from an old shelf dry shipping manifests that had curled from age. The metal barrel she'd used before sat in the corner, half rusted, half soot-stained, like some primitive hearth carved from a dead century. She moved slow, not because she lacked energy, but because she had learned long ago that moving slow kept panic from gaining traction in the bloodstream. Ranger lay near the doorway, his large frame a shield of fur and muscle, the sable coat glinting faintly in the low lantern glow. He wasn't asleep. German shepherds especially, around 7 years old, reached a kind of perfect working maturity. His ears flicked once every few seconds, his amber eyes open, processing darkness. He was the wall between danger and the two women. Audrey sat hunched against the wall, opposite Grace coat collar, pulled up gloves still on the photo of her father, still tucked in her inner pocket, like an artery she didn't want exposed to the air. She wasn't crying, not the dramatic kind, but her hands were trembling in a micro shiver, the kind trauma produces not from sadness, but from the body suddenly being removed from adrenaline. Grace didn't comment on the shaking. She knew what it meant. It meant Audrey's nervous system was recalibrating. It meant Audrey had been strong in the chase, in the immediate threat, and now the shock was settling like frost. Grace knelt by the barrel, used a disposable lighter, flicked twice, and then caught flame to the manifests. The flame blossomed orange, then gold, then licked up the pallet wood. A low, warm glow pushed the shadows back a few inches. She sat near it, hands extended, and tilted her head slightly toward Audrey. "You need to get heat back in your core," she said simply. "Hands on stomach first, then chest. Don't worry about toes yet." It wasn't spoken like advice. It was instruction, the way an EMT speaks to a frightened accident survivor. Audrey watched her hands as if they didn't belong to her body, then followed Grace's cue. Slowly, she moved closer to the barrel and let the heat seep into her. Grace then opened her pack. Inside was a vacuum-sealed MRE bar and half a bag of kibble wrapped tight. She broke the MRE in two-handed half to Audrey without ceremony and poured a small mound of kibble onto a rag for Ranger, who waited motionless until Grace tapped twice on the concrete to release him. Audrey stared at the MRE chunk like she didn't know how to eat it. Grace took a bite of her portion, chewed, swallowed. "Focus on chewing," she murmured. "You chew, your brain settles. You swallow, your stomach stops panicking." For a few seconds, Audrey obeyed. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, not a whisper from fear, but a whisper from realization. I thought you were homeless. Grace didn't flinch. I thought I was too. Audrey looked up, fast, eyes sharp. That's not what I meant. Grace didn't argue. She knew Audrey's meaning. Audrey stared at her longer, really seeing her. Grace's height, about 5'7", and the way pregnancy had changed her posture, weight shifted to heel hands, subconsciously guarding the belly. Hazel eyes that were too alert for someone who supposedly had nothing. Brown hair grown out into a messy half-wave. Clothes that were worn, but not slovenly patched meticulously at elbows and at knee seams. These were not the clothes of a woman who gave up. They were the clothes of a woman who survived deliberately. Audrey's voice came again, but softer, as if she were embarrassed by her old assumptions. You're not some random person who just got lucky buying a storage unit. Grace fixed her gaze on the fire, jaw tightening with memory. Luck has never done me any favors. She said the sentence like iron dropped in snow. Audrey leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes, breathing slower. Her pulse was coming down. Ranger shifted position once, just enough to put his large forelegs fully extended toward the door. His tail was still his whole body in a straight line, pointing toward the hallway like an arrow ready to spring. Grace watched him. He won't sleep, Grace said. Not until sunrise. Audrey's voice was faint, almost reverent. He understands all that? Grace nodded. He understands more than most people I've met. They sat in silence for a while. Grace's mind stumbled into memory. Not the sentimental kind, but the brutal kind that sticks like barbed wire. She remembered a maternity shelter worker once telling her that women like her needed more structure. Grace remembered walking out because that worker said she'd have to give up Ranger to get a bed. She remembered thinking that losing her dog would be the end of her last working piece of sanity. Grace blinked once, grounding back into the present. Firelight flickered on bare brick. Audrey opened her eyes again, studying Grace's profile in the light. "How long have you been outside?" she asked. Grace kept her tone flat. "Long enough that I stopped counting winters." Audrey absorbed that answer, like someone who suddenly realized the floor under their theory of the world had collapsed. Then Audrey's voice changed, smaller now, but also deeper. "My father would have trusted you," she whispered. Grace didn't look at her, just said quietly, "I hope so." A gust of wind howled through the steel rafters above like some old monstrous breath. Ranger flicked his ears, stayed still. Muscles tight, but not alarmed. Grace felt the baby shift inside her belly, an elbow or a knee pressing the tight wall of her skin, and she pressed her hand there instinctively. The tiny pulse of life inside her chest felt like a rebellion against everything Palmer had tried to bury. Audrey saw it, and for the first time, a look of awe cracked the surface of her face. "You're carrying a child," she murmured. "In the middle of this." Grace's voice barely moved the air. "That's exactly why I can't afford to lose." Outside, an engine hummed in the far distance, maybe a snowplow, maybe a patrol car. Then silence returned. Grace sat closer to the fire. Audrey sat beside her. And Ranger, their silent sentinel, rested his chin on his paws, but his eyes stayed pointed at the door, like twin lanterns guarding the threshold. And through the winter steel, through fear and exhaustion, something undeniable settled between the three of them. Not comfort, but something better, a sober alliance, a new kind of resolve, because the snow didn't care about truth, or murder, or corruption. But these three now did. And winter nights in Cleveland weren't the kind you simply survived. They were the kind you used as iron to temper every piece of purpose in your bones. Morning in Cleveland wasn't mercy. It was a blade of cold, brighter than night. The steel mill windows looked like frozen lungs exhaling nothing. Grace woke stiff back, hurting from concrete, the baby heavy like gravity had doubled overnight. Ranger was already sitting upright by the door, alert tail, still body in perfect statue posture. Audrey had fallen asleep with her head drooped forward on her knees. Grace gently nudged her shoulder. Audrey startled awake, then blinked, remembering they were not in a house, not in an apartment, but in the rusted rib cage of a forgotten factory. "Do we even know if Jack survived the decoy run?" Audrey whispered. Grace answered flatly. "If Jack didn't make it, we'd have company right now." 10 minutes later, headlights swept across the broken lot like a slow scanning white sword. A white BMW X3 rolled in. The engine cut. Doors opened. 3 figures stepped out. First, Claire Park. The woman moved like a winter arrow. Asian American. Mid-40s, about 5'4", slim, but built like coiled piano wire. Hair jet black, tied in a low bun, so tight it looked like not a single strand had ever dared escape her discipline. Claire Park was not the kind of lawyer that ever tried to charm her way into anything. Her face was minimal makeup, but sharp features, straight nose, fine jaw, and eyes that radiated the same kind of cold efficiency that laser scalpels have. She walked with her hands in black leather gloves. Claire Park was a woman sculpted entirely out of control. Behind her, Jake Miller, the investigative reporter, Grace had only heard Audrey describe briefly. He was mid-30s, white guy, a little rumpled in a wrinkled navy wool coat with a faint beard shadow that suggested chronic sleep debt and too many deadlines. His eyes were sharp, though blue, and precise, like someone who sees patterns obsessively and gets physically restless if he can't connect dots. Jake was the type who wrote late-night copy while eating dry cereal from the box and didn't know how to stop until his curiosity had been fed to exhaustion. The third man was Jack Harris, alive, a little winded coat dusted with road salt, but standing. He held the steel case like it was a newborn. Claire scanned the mill interior. Once, took in the barrel, the pallet debris, the brick shelter, the two women, the German shepherd, and made an internal evaluation that she did not voice. But Grace saw it in her eyes. Claire instantly assessed this wasn't chaos. It was strategy, born from necessity. "We need a table," Claire said, by way of greeting. Jake motioned to a portable folding table he'd already started carrying in from the trunk. He set it upright in a rectangle of pale morning light. Claire placed 3 laptops, 2 drives, and a legal pad on the surface like she was setting up a war room. "Before we start, I need to confirm evidence chain," Claire said. Her voice wasn't warm. It was steel. Audrey pulled the leather-bound journal from her coat. Claire's face changed 1 inch, jaw tightened. Jake Miller looked like someone handed him holy scripture. He sat and opened the book slowly, as if turning pages of a fragile human soul. Claire put on white latex gloves, opened the manila folders, and the ledgers, and the microcassette. She tapped a key on one of her laptops. "We digitize everything. We make 3 encrypted copies. One goes to an off-site server owned by a newspaper in New York. One goes to a secure data vault in Boston." She looked at Jake. "And one goes in my private safe deposit box." Jake's eyes were lit with a fire that was not ego. It was the fire born from years of being called hysterical for believing corruption existed. "I want to verify these ledger entries. Match known shell companies," he muttered, already typing names into databases like he was breathing through his fingers. Claire looked at Grace then. Not Audrey. Grace. "You were the first witness to access this material?" Grace nodded. "Claire, you realize this could blow up every elected office that signed off on Palmer's permits." Grace held Claire's gaze. "That's why we're here." Claire simply said, "Good." This was the moment the alliance was formalized, not in signatures, but in eye contact between women who had nothing left to lose but their last piece of self-respect. Claire flipped through evidence, and her face changed when she hit page 42 of the journal. This, she said, mentions 6 other men. Jake reacted instantly. I've read microfiche clippings from those deaths, construction site fatalities. Claire turned to Audrey. I need family contacts. Audrey didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone, then froze. They're probably monitoring this. Claire nodded and handed her a burner. Audrey typed in 6 numbers. Within an hour, 6 families answered back. Claire Park's face, normally expressionless, softened just barely. We have what the law calls pattern of deliberate malfeasance, she murmured. Jake said softly, almost reverent. This is the biggest environmental homicide case since Love Canal. Claire didn't argue or dramatize. She simply said, then we must sharpen the blade. They worked until sunset, digitizing each piece. Ranger sat alert, head rotating slowly, every time a truck passed the road outside. Climate in the brick office shifted from fear to tactical focus. The next morning, Richard Palmer himself came. Not security, not lawyers. Palmer. A black Mercedes S-Class rolled onto the empty lot tires, slicing over frost. The door opened, and Richard Palmer stepped out like a king who still believed the throne was his. He was older, probably 78, but tall, white hair, slicked back, face tanned, and surgical smooth. His suit was charcoal with a dark emerald scarf. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, the eyes of a man who always believed everything was purchasable at the right price. 2 bodyguards flanked him. Thick men with shaved heads and coats too light for the weather, because men like that prefer mobility over warmth. Palmer walked forward smiling like an emperor, pretending to be benevolent. Miss Park, he said. Claire didn't smile. She pointed to the table. All evidence laid bare. Ledgers permits the photo of Jonathan holding Audrey as a toddler. Palmer's face flickered. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement, he said softly. Claire spoke first, cold and surgical. You will sign a full public admission of criminal cover-up. You will fund a $20 million settlement pool for the families, and you will donate $30 million to a workplace safety endowment. Palmer stared, and then Claire did something that made Jake Miller gasp. She pushed the microcassette recorder toward him. If you don't, she said, tomorrow morning, Jake will publish the tape that captures your voice discussing the gas leak. The original is already in 3 vaults. You can't bury this. Palmer's eyes went dead. Like a predator, realizing a deeper predator existed in the room. "Give me the damned pen," he said. And he signed. He signed everything. The signature that had killed a man 30 years ago was now the signature that destroyed his empire. The next morning, Cleveland erupted like a storm of truth had finally shattered through concrete. Jake Miller's investigative column went live just before dawn, and within 30 minutes, every major local outlet picked it up, headline in massive letters, "Cuyahoga, cover up." The online comments exploded. TV anchors on morning shows had brittle disbelief in their voices, like they were reading from scripts that sounded like fiction. Twitter threads multiplied like Hydra heads. Audiences were stunned, then furious, then hungry. It only took 3 hours before Palmer Development Group's stock fell, like someone had cut the elevator cables minus 12% in the first hour, minus 22% by noon. In the financial district downtown, men in expensive coats pulled phones from pockets like panicked priests who had just realized the god they worshipped had been made of cheap tin. By afternoon, the mayor's office released a public statement calling for a full and immediate review of any and all development contracts connected to Palmer Development Group going back 35 years. It wasn't because the mayor was suddenly moral. It was because the city smelled blood, and politicians always migrated toward whatever direction the wind was screaming the loudest. Grace and Audrey stayed at Claire's office that morning because Claire Park had bought them a temporary shield in pure legal force field form. Her office was on the 21st floor of a high-rise glass walls, minimalist furniture in neutral wood tones, a single bonsai plant on her desk, like a symbol of precise order. Claire's receptionist, Janelle, a tall black woman, mid-30s, with short braids and sharp cheekbones, looked at Grace differently now. Not with pity, not with curiosity, but with respect. That kind of respect that comes from seeing someone go from the edge of survival to the nerve center of a corporate execution. Meanwhile, Ranger lay on the carpet beside Grace's chair, relaxed for once, paws crossed, head on floor, but eyes still open. Always processing, always guarding. Audrey was on the phone with her mother. Grace tried to give her privacy, but the room was small. Audrey's mother had a gravelly voice, the kind of voice of a woman who had yelled in union halls in the 80s. At first, Audrey's voice seemed tight, half performing strength, half scared. Then she said, "Mom, we have Dad's truth now." And suddenly, her voice cracked, hard, like something inside her had been held tight for 20 years, and finally snapped. After the call, Audrey walked to the window and stared down at Cleveland, 30 floors below the lake in the distance, like a frozen sheet of pewter. The streets below, dusted in white smoke rising from salt trucks. Then she turned back to Grace. "I can reclaim the plant," she whispered. "Legally. I have rights through my father's deed." Grace blinked. It made sense, but felt surreal. The place where she had been sleeping to avoid dying in the snow might now belong to Audrey, by right. Audrey paced slowly across the glass office floor in her navy coat, hands tucked in pockets, lips pressed tight in the way people press them when ideas become decisions inside them. "My father always wanted the steelworks land converted into a public asset," she said quietly, mind half in memory, half in blueprint. "He said the river was poisoned by industry, so the city owed the people a monument of healing in return." She swallowed, eyes bright with that fierce resolution Grace had only seen glimpsed before. "So I'm going to build it. All of it?" Grace asked. "Build what?" And Audrey answered, like she had already carved the future in concrete. "Affordable housing, a park, community spaces, a support center for veterans, and one division specifically dedicated to pregnant homeless women." Grace's ears rang. It felt surreal, too sudden, too large. And then Audrey stepped closer and looked Grace in the eyes, not the way journalists or lawyers did, but as if they were two humans standing on the same precipice of new possibility. "I want you to run operations and security for the entire project," she said softly. "You know how the streets work. You know danger before it arrives. You know survival better than any management consultant the city will try to send me." Grace stared at her. She said, like maybe Audrey had mispronounced a name. But Audrey nodded. "You." Ranger lifted his head. Ears perked, as if he knew this was a pivotal moment. Audrey continued voice stable with conviction. "Grace, I've known rich executives my whole life. I've known attorneys, professors, activists. None of them know how to survive like you survived. None of them know how to turn nothing into flame." Grace felt her throat tighten. For years she had been seen as problem, obstacle, liability, something to manage or remove. But here in a conference room high above Cleveland, she was being told she was competent, valuable, necessary. Audrey placed her hand gently, not dramatically, not performatively, on Grace's shoulder. "You said you never get luck," she murmured. "Then, fine. I won't call this luck. I'll call this earned." Grace didn't cry. She half closed her eyes to force the tears back, because tears would make her feel like she was losing control. The baby moved inside her belly, rolling gently like wave on tide. Grace covered her belly with her hand. And then something happened outside a sound shift in the city, like a hive changing its frequency. Sirens, not emergency sirens, but car horns shouting chants. Jake ran from the hallway with his phone in his hand. "It's happening," he said. "People are in public square chanting Palmer's name like a curse." Claire Park stepped into the doorway. Behind him, expression unreadable as always. "The city has woken up," Claire said. "You did this." Grace didn't correct her. Grace didn't say, "We did this." She wasn't ready yet to own the weight of credit. But Ranger shifted closer to her chair and pressed his forehead against her leg, as if to say, "Yes, you did." And for the first time in her adult life, Grace believed maybe she wasn't a ghost drifting through a city that had forgotten her name. For the first time, Grace believed she might actually belong to the world she just helped set on fire. 6 months later, Cleveland did not feel like the same city. Winter had peeled back like an old scar, and the first breath of spring felt almost obscene in its gentleness. The Cuyahoga Steelworks lot, once a mausoleum of rust, was now a construction orchestra. Tower cranes swung overhead like enormous mechanical herons. Excavators chewed the earth. Concrete mixers rotated like patient hearts, pumping wet gray blood into the foundations of tomorrow. Workers in bright neon vests moved like a coordinated colony of ants. Every hour, every corner of the steel skeleton was being rewired, replumbed, reborn. Grace walked the site every sunrise. She walked slowly. Now she was nearly at the end of her pregnancy, and her belly curved outward like the horizon itself had begun to shape her. She wore a thick denim work jacket with reflective stripes, her operations and safety chief patch stitched on the chest. She wore sturdy boots, soles, thick enough to take nails and gravel. Her hair was longer now. She let it grow, and she kept it half braided, half loose, because she felt like she earned the right to not tie herself so tight anymore. And always, Ranger walked beside her. Ranger was older now, but not old. 8 years old, but in peak mature strength. His black and brown sable coat gleamed in the sunlight. His gait was proud. On this site, workers treated him almost like a mascot or a sheriff. Men who barely respected foremen respected Ranger. He could walk through a crowd of electricians and welders and pipe fitters, and no one questioned why that dog had free rein. They said the place belonged to him anyway. Audrey had turned the old guardhouse, where Grace once hid from thugs in winter, into Grace's office. They insulated it, rewired it, replaced the cracked glass with double-pane windows. Now sunlight poured inside in clean rectangles. There was a wide wooden desk built by a veteran carpenter. The project hired a man named Earl Jennings, an older Black Marine veteran with a faded USMC tattoo on his forearm and hands like carved walnut. Earl had thin salt and pepper dreadlocks pulled back into a tail and wore a permanent expression of stoic good humor, as if he had seen every kind of cruelty on earth already. So now, any ordinary hardship was just a passing cloud. Earl said to Grace the day he delivered the desk, "A woman who survived winter, like you, deserve something solid, not pressed plywood junk." Grace touched the finished wood with reverence. Earl winked and said, "Real oak. Same wood they used for ships that crossed the Atlantic. A desk like this doesn't bow." Now on this bright spring morning, Earl worked outside, installing benches along the new pedestrian walkway. The steel mill was slowly becoming a city. The community clinic was halfway framed. Pipes were in for the Veterans Resource Center. The walls for the low-income housing units were rising like foam from the ground, new, white, spacious, affordable. And the part that was Grace's personal favorite was the maternity wing blueprint, a dedicated wing of the community center where pregnant, homeless women could live for 6 months at a time, supported, fed, protected. Grace had drawn the first sketches of that herself shaky handwriting on graph paper one night by the barrel fire. Now those lines were turning into drywall and copper pipes. Audrey walked across the gravel in a soft tan coat and wide sunglasses. She was still a public figure, now still recognized, still in danger because of angry investors who lost millions. But she walked the site like a woman who could command storms. She stopped by Grace's office doorway and leaned on the frame. The water lines just passed. Inspection, Audrey said. No delays. Grace nodded proud. City is finally scared of messing up around us now. Audrey smirked. Voice warm, but with old edge. Funny how truth makes cowards out of powerful men. Ranger rose and nudged Audrey's leg. Audrey petted his head. You did good, Ranger. The dog closed his eyes, briefly, receiving acknowledgement, like a knight receiving a medal. Then the baby inside Grace moved a small roll. Grace placed her hand on her belly, steadying her breath. Audrey watched the hand, then said with quiet certainty, You'll be a good mother. Grace almost laughed, because she'd never heard anyone say that sentence to her in any world. Audrey sat on the desk edge. Grace sank into her chair slowly and breathed. Construction noises rolled outside, hammers, drills, reversed, trucks, beeping men shouting measurements. It sounded like life assembling itself. Claire Park still handled legal work, but she was rarely on site now. She had moved on to forming new public interest litigation groups that would watchdog every major industrial developer. Jake Miller had been nominated for a National Journalism Award. Jack Harris still visited once a week. He helped train the new community security team. Those recruits included 3 veterans, 2 women who had survived domestic violence, and a young man named Luis who had aged out of foster care. Jack taught them tactics that were not about force, but about foresight, how to smell danger before it had a physical form. Jack himself had softened. His eyes weren't as haunted now. Sometimes he stayed late and talked with Ranger, like Ranger was the only creature he trusted more than his own instincts. Grace learned that Jack liked black coffee with 1 sugar, and that he hated the FBI's new leadership with a personal, bone-deep conviction. But that now, working for this place, some piece of his soul had unclenched. The old steel mill had become a collective recovery machine. People healed their past by building future walls. Grace leaned back in her chair. Ranger laid down in front of the door, front paws crossed, head lifted like a doorman with teeth. And outside, the glass spring sunlight flooded the world. Families walked by the site, now pointing, imagining what would be. A reporter filmed a segment about the miracle on Cuyahoga. Grace watched them, and she realized something. That story wasn't a miracle. It was a war fought by ordinary people who decided not to surrender to winter. Grace placed both hands on her belly. The baby kicked once, light, strong, almost rhythmic. She whispered, "You're coming into a world that didn't exist before we built it." Ranger's ears flicked as if he agreed. And Audrey, standing against the window, looked out at the blooming new steelworks like someone watching her father, finally resurrected, not as a ghost, but as a city. Cleveland, in spring sunlight, didn't feel like the place that once tried to bury truth. Cleveland in spring felt like a place that could grow anything, now even justice. Sometimes, people think miracles are fireworks from heaven, loud, shining, impossible. But the older you get, the more you realize God's miracles are often quiet. A loyal dog barking at the right moment. A sealed letter forgotten for 30 years. A pregnant woman in winter who refused to give up. God rarely sends the miracle fully formed. God sends the seed and waits to see who is brave enough to stand up and plant it. Maybe the miracle you're asking for right now is already in your hand, and you just haven't recognized it yet. In our daily life, every day, God sends tiny signs, a stranger's smile, a small coincidence, a sudden thought of courage, a random person who appears at the right time. None of these are accidents. They are God's gentle whisper to your heart. Keep going. I am still here. And if you're still here, at the end of this story, I believe it's not random. I believe you also carry a piece of one of His miracles, just like Grace did. So please believe in it. Step toward it. Hold on to it. If you believe God is real and still works through ordinary people to do extraordinary things today, comment Amen below. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that there is still a way forward. And if you want more real stories like this, stories of hope, redemption, faith, and the quiet miracles God still sends, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us every week as we witness more of His hidden miracles together. May God bless you. May He bless your family. May He comfort the brokenhearted, strengthen the weary, and protect every soul watching this video. Amen.